Hello, and welcome to Keep Left, the podcast that looks at things from the left side of the political spectrum. I'm John O'Connor. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. And in a previous life, I was a constitutional law professor for a law school in Central California. Before that, I was a undergrad student at Pomona College, which will become relevant a little bit later on. And if you have been checking out the news, because there's been a lot going on, but one of the things that happened is that a fantastic organization known as ProPublica got a hold of the training videos for Project 2025, this tiny little group that had nothing to do whatsoever with the Trump administration, wasn't even remotely associated with it somehow, and yet they had a budget of about $70 million from various sources and had about at least 14 hours of training videos. Now, a couple groups, including ProPublica, which is an organization dedicated towards, among other things, transparency in government, put these on YouTube, and I'm going to go through a few of these over the next couple weeks, as many as I can before I assume they'll get taken down. But for as long as they're up, I'm going to try to get through as much as possible. I'm going to start with one. A lot of these I'm going to react for the first time to them. This one I've actually watched once before just to get a sense of what they're about. This one is called Conserving America. And I wanted to start here because it's kind of an overview of a history of America as the people behind Project 2025 see it. And it's also sort of their theory of the case, if you will. It's kind of how they see what America is all about and their case for why they're right and us weirdo progressives are wrong, or at least anyone to the left of them. So it's about 30 minutes long, 35 minutes long. I'll set it up as a regular reaction style video, and I'll pause it at different points to sort of talk about what specifically they've gotten wrong and so forth. So join me as we dive into Project 2025 private training video, Conserving America. And we'll get this started up. And you will see as we get in here that ProPublica obtained them, and it's definitely meant to train political appointees for the next conservative administration. And thank you to both ProPublica and Documented for getting their hands on these. I wouldn't be surprised if there were copyright takedown notices coming at some point in the very near future. But interesting note, for $70 million, you'll see just how much you get for that amount of money, which is to say, not a whole lot.
Hello, I'm Matthew Spaulding, Vice President of Hillsdale College. I'm at our Washington, D.C. campus, where I'm...
Just to start out, Matthew Spaulding, Vice President of Hillsdale College. Hillsdale College is a private, probably for-profit institution. I have to check on that. Spaulding came through the Claremont colleges, specifically Claremont McKenna College. For those of you who don't know, the Claremont colleges are a group of small private liberal arts colleges in Southern California. They're comprised of Pomona College, Go Sage Hens, Pitzer College, Scripps College, which is an all-women's college, Claremont McKenna College, and Harvey Mudd College, which is a science and engineering focused college. And they all have different sort of personalities. Pomona is essentially supposed to be a West Coast version of Amherst and Williams and those sorts of colleges. Claremont McKenna was originally a men's college. After a period of time, it went co-ed. The joke was that they found someone named McKenna to donate a lot of money to change the name to Claremont McKenna, so they didn't have to change the monograms on the towels. It was always for the rich people there. Matthew Spaulding then went to get his master's and PhD at the local Claremont Graduate School, which at the time I was there in the 90s was sort of just getting its feet on its feet, but over time has become kind of a hotbed of conservative theorists and theoreticians, and the Claremont school, the Claremont grouping has become synonymous with the theoretical underpinnings, if you will, of the Trump and MAGA movement. And so he has sort of been kind of the part of the farm team of conservative ideology over the last 10 years. He's now the vice president of Hillsdale College, which is this private institution that's funded by a lot of right-wingers to try to push this sort of agenda.
Also, the dean of the Stephen Amy Van Andel Graduate School of Government. I'd like to speak to you today about our common purpose, about America's common purpose, the things that are inherently American and that are at the heart of American conservatism.
Yes, the heart of American conservatism.
In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle.
Today is the concrete expression of a stunning fact. These 200 years since our...
I do like how they start with this idea of transition. Very ironic. They kind of skip over January 6th, of course. Nice to throw a bone for Democrats there, including Obama in there as well as a few other Democrats.
Government began.
In America, we understand that a nation is only living as long as it is striving.
As long as it is striving. Funny fact about the gerund striving, one isn't just striving, one is striving towards something. But what do I know about English?
We face a hostile ideology, ruthless in purpose and insidious in method.
Let's back up there for a second. First off, Eisenhower, at the time, not talking about gender critical issues, not talking at all about gender Kampf. I don't even know what that means. Gender is an English word. Kampf would mean German for struggle. I assume that means, whatever J.D. Vance is going through in those drag pictures that are out there. We now have things of, council culture, and so forth.
And insidious.
Has nothing to do with whatever Eisenhower was talking
Only
about.
a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom.
I like this sort of Photoshop Premiere usage of the various frames and formats here over there on the left.
It's hour of maximum danger.
Being an American involves the embrace of high ideals.
We need leaders of inspired idealism, leaders who dream greatly.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
It is funny how they go from Rushmore to Lincoln Memorial to George W. Bush to the White House. Very patriotic.
Whether we go forward together with courage or turn back to policies that weakened our economy, diminished our leadership in the world, America's future will be in your hands.
I like, by the way, how every single president, including Obama, including FDR, who was sort of the evil boogeyman of right-wing obsessives, is listed here, but Biden is the bad guy. Project 2025, and that is the seal of the president. I'll have to check on this, but I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to use the seal of the president for private purposes.
There are many things upon which we disagree concerning domestic policy, foreign policy, economic policy. Those disagreements are important, and it's important that we discuss and deliberate and resolve those disagreements. But those disagreements should not blind us to the things we hold in common, the more important and higher aspects of America's purpose,
Right.
but also the things we wish to conserve. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton famously disagreed on just about everything you can imagine.
True.
Especially when it came to important national policies.
Subject of many different raps, by the way. Rap battles, famously.
But they agreed deeply on the most fundamental questions about the rights of man grounded in nature, about the essence of the rule of law and constitutional government.
Ooh.
Those are the things that are important for us to understand, because those things in addition to various policy matters we as conservatives hold to be true. But those things, the more fundamental things, are the essence, the foundation of conservatism. So I'm not going to talk about conservatism as much as that we wish to conserve. Those are the principles that are our inheritance. And those are the principles growing out of the Greeks and the Romans.
Now, interesting sleight of hand rhetoric here going on that, we are looking for the fundamental principles on which American government is based that bind both Hamilton and Jefferson together, which is this faith in the rule of law, fair, but also this idea that it's coming from a state of nature, which, I mean, that's sort of a political theory that was bouncing around at the time of the founders. And you might say that more with Jefferson than with Hamilton, but I kind of get the feeling from Hamilton's papers that he was much more of a pragmatic utilitarian. He didn't really care where it came from as long as we were going in a particular direction that brought everyone together as a practical matter. But, that gets into sort of deep dives. And now we go to this idea that our political culture came from ancient Egypt. No, would never come from Africa. Well, my apologies. That it comes from Greek, Roman, and let's not forget Jerusalem.
Going through British constitutionalism that culminate in America. So as we deliberate and discuss the policy questions that we need to determine, it is important to keep in mind the larger objective, which is to recover, to restore, to conserve, and to save our country.
To recover, restore, to save our country is the goal of conservatism. I would have to check on Burke on that. There's no citation, of course, for this. We're just going to have to take his word for it. I love these kind of videos where people just sort of throw things at a screen and say, just trust me. I'm the president of this college you've never heard of, and this is the goal of conservatism, to recover our country. Always important to ask these questions. Recover from what? To restore our country from what? To conserve, well, conserve has a lot of different meanings, and to save our country. Again, what we're missing from all of these things are from what? To what? But hopefully he'll answer those questions.
Recover, to restore, to conserve, and to save our country. Every nation derives some meaning from underlying ideas, from its ethnic background, its character, common religion, and shared history.
Ethnic background, folks. Let's just underscore that for a second there. Every country derives its meaning from its ethnic background. Every country derives its meaning from its ethnic background. No, not really. I'm fairly certain Canada, the U.S., does Australia do that? I mean, New Zealand. I mean, some do, I suppose, but there's a whole bunch of courses in sociology, anthropology, ethnomusicology. Take your picks. You can point at 1/3 of all courses taught in college today, or that should be taught in college, that point to the fact that most ethnicities are constructed, most nations are constructed. You can look at the maps of Africa and put all the ethnicities there, and they don't match up, folks.
But this country is actually different.
Oh,
it was founded at a particular time, in a particular place, by a particular people. And it is that rich heritage.
Unlike every other country, like Canada was certainly not founded at a particular time or place by a particular people. Certainly not the New Zealand or Australia.
Of ideas, especially those stated in our core fundamental documents, that define us still as a nation and as a people. America was revolutionary.
By the way, I love that in the artwork that's chosen for this, and I'm not sure why there's, I don't know this painting in particular. I'm curious as to why there's what appears to be a First Nations or Indigenous person there on the front left. But I think they're pulling down a statue of King George, unless I'm mistaken. And, I thought we weren't supposed to pull down statues, but,
But not in the way we normally think of that word, especially if we have in mind the French Revolution or the communist revolutions in Russia or Cuba. It was revolutionary in the sense of ideas. It was in the minds and the hearts of the people, John Adams once wrote. That was the source of the real American Revolution. It was...
Look, I'm not one to badmouth John Adams. He was far smarter than I would ever purport to be. But I would never propose that we take the words of a person writing their own memoirs of something that happened, 40 years prior, when he's writing almost on his deathbed to his old chum from those time periods as to what was actually going on. Bearing in mind, on top of all that, folks, as I think I'll touch on a little bit later, the revolution was not, as he actually does concede here, the American Revolution was not a revolution of the people. It was a conservative revolution. He's kind of right about that, but not for the reasons I think he would like to say, and which kind of undercuts some of his arguments here.
About the ideas upon which a nation was to be established. Ideas that are applicable to all men in all times, as Abraham Lincoln once said. And they proclaimed that principle rather than will was to be the ultimate ground of government. It was at a particular time in history that these universal ideas became the foundation of a particular system of government and a particular political culture. And that revolution culminated not in the guillotine, but in constitutional government.
Guillotine.
A government that is long endured. Those ideas, which we want to discuss briefly, are found in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
We'll get over the fact that after the French Revolution, there was actually attempts at reducing French government to various paper documents that didn't succeed for a lot of different reasons, and that one could make the argument that the system of litigation constructed by the British government, brought over by lawyers from Britain to America, is what really meant that the constitutional system was actually going to succeed. But, let's not get bogged down in historical details like that.
Those ideas still define us as much as they are debated in many parts of our media and culture.
And let's not also get to the sense that there is a tension between how we frame what our nation is about. I think it's fair to say that for most of us on the left, the documents we point to most often is the Constitution and the amendments, the Bill of Rights, and so forth. And typically, if you ask people on the right what is the most important document, they will point to the Declaration of Independence. And it'll be interesting to see as we go through this which document he relies more on.
And they define us because our system points backward, not merely historically backward, but as a practical matter. Our first law is our highest law, the Constitution. And our system, in principle, is built upon the foundations of the Declaration of Independence. Those ideas, that Constitution, still are beacons for everyone in the world. They're still warnings for despots around the world. And they are still the brightest lights and the greatest inspiration for freedom and liberty in the world, but especially here at home. Although much of our history begins earlier, we can define the American founding period as encompassing two pivotal moments. One is between 1775, the opening.
I wouldn't say pivotal moments and then give you a range of dates. I think that's not what a moment is. And I will give him props for indicating that history does begin before 1775. A lot of people who sort of purport to talk about American history don't even do that. But I will also say I am petty enough to note that after $70 million and a lot of money spent on this, they couldn't afford a teleprompter for this poor guy because he's obviously reading from either a notepad or some kind of like a paper notepad or a Mac notepad or something like that. But also apparently they couldn't afford closing parentheses because after the Battle of Lexington there is no parentheses, and I'm just petty enough to point that out. But let's continue.
Lexington and the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the American Revolution.
Right.
And the other is after the Revolution, in 1785, when it starts earnestly getting a movement towards the Constitution. And then perhaps 1797, the constitutional period at the end of Washington's first administration. And those two periods are dominated by two monumental documents.
No one in American history truly cares about the interregnum between the end of the Revolution and the Constitution. I mean, I'm being overdramatic, but typically, obviously there are historians who really care about that period, and it's worth looking at. But virtually nothing really begins until the Constitution is written, because it's just a period of fall-on-your-face chaos. But go on.
The Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. The movement towards the Declaration of Independence begins in 1763. America, we can say, begins as a tax revolt. The British, after the French and Indian War,
it's a representation revolt, but sure, go.
And they sought that revenue by tax bills, taxing the American colonists. The American colonists objected from the very beginning on the grounds that, historically, all the way back to Magna Carta, they had a right against taxation without representation.
Magna Carta was revoked 2 years after it was instituted. It wasn't until 200 years later that various people in British government tried to breathe into it new life as a mode of constraint on the king. Actually, a couple centuries later. If you read Shakespeare's King John, there's actually no mention of it because during the Elizabethan age, it had no historical weight whatsoever. So the Magna Carta is a bit of a myth. It sort of comes into mythical persuasion much later. And, you can sort of say, our history is based on an invention of what the Magna Carta purports to represent. But that's too complicated for most historians to get into, especially a Claremont McKenna type. Not that I have any sort of bone to pick with anyone from Claremont McKenna, far from it. Not that my college is a big rival with our college. But anyway, and beyond that, there is a representation issue. From the British perspective at the time, they had spent a lot of money on the French and Indian War, sending troops out to North America to defend what was considered to be their colonies. The American troops supporting their end of things were terrible, to put it mildly. If you read the accounts of George Washington's first attempt at leading troops, it was a complete and total disaster, for example. And I think that was reflective of a lot of American involvement at the time. And so they were essentially trying to offset the losses that they had incurred, the British government had incurred.
British passed tax bills and then revoked those bills, but always maintained they had the right to pass whatever legislation they wanted in all circumstances whatsoever. After one of those acts, the American colonists got together for the first time in what is called the Stamp Act Congress. That legislation was also withdrawn, but the British continued to pass various measures, including measures to tax various goods, including tea, which, after all else had been withdrawn except for that tax, the Americans dumped into Boston Harbor. That, of course, led to the First Continental Congress. But something very important happened.
There's a counter explanation for this too, by the way. There is an argument to be made that the reason why some of those colonists were upset about the The tea tax was that a lot of those colonists were running tea into the colonies without registering it. They were essentially getting away without taxes, and the tea tax meant that there were they had to register it, and it made it much more difficult to run it by the authorities. And so by dumping the tea, they were those colonists were essentially getting rid of the competition. Sorry, I hate to be revisionist about these things.
The First Continental Congress. They started to debate and discuss the grounds upon which they might need to establish their independence. Up to that time, they had largely acted to defend and appeal to their rights as Englishmen, rights going back to Magna Carta itself and coming down through British constitutionalism. But they realized that that ground would not be sufficient to fight a war against the British king. And so they considered other options in a debate at the First Continental Congress. Our charters, our rights before Parliament. Ultimately, they chose to ground their claims upon nature, a more philosophically and more fundamental ground that was a defense of rights behind Magna Carta, behind and beyond the rights of Englishmen to their rights as humans. And so they turned to nature as the ground for the claim of rights, the ground upon which they would make their claims of independence, the grounds upon which they would assert their rights as an independent nation. And it was this turn to nature that is classically represented in the Declaration of Independence, but seen throughout many of the documents developing from the 1760s to 1776. It's classically stated within the Declaration of Independence by reference to the laws of nature and nature's God.
Now, that language is in the Declaration of Independence, and he's not wrong to sort of put it that way, but that's a way over, as you might imagine, it's a far oversimplification of what is actually happening there. To understand what is at play, we'd have to get into a lot of the philosophical goings-ons at the time, but there were a number of political theorists of the time, most notably John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, and Rousseau of France, who were discussing how best to explain government. Why do people engage in a form of government? How does authority derive? Where does it come from? Does it come from God? Does it come from the people? And prior to the Age of Enlightenment, prior to the Renaissance, it was very much a religious definition of authority. It was the essentially chain of command, a divine right of kings. God, through the Pope or through the local religious organization, ordained the king to rule over an area, and therefore by that process gained the divine right to rule over the individuals within that area. And the Pope could excommunicate the king, which thereby voided your responsibility to obey that king. And that was the theory. Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, and to various means, and I'm oversimplifying, saw it more as a kind of different forms of a social contract. The idea that individuals enter into a kind of contract with each other, giving up some of their own personal authority, and in order to make sure either that they wouldn't be killed or that everyone would benefit, depending on whether you had an optimistic or pessimistic view of human nature. And a lot of this idea of the laws of nature, nature's God, comes from Rousseau, where he was trying to posit, if you put people in a state of nature without civilization, how would they behave? How would they organize themselves? Like if you just started from scratch, how would that happen? How would they obey? How would they behave themselves according to the laws of nature? And in some ways, calling it nature's God was kind of a throwaway to people who believed in some sort of divinity or some sort of thing like that. It tended to be more in the framework of a small g god, if you will, not so much as a recognizing a belief in some kind of divine creator. There's a reference later on in the Declaration of Independence to divine providence. They were generally, when they make this phrase, they were generally pointing towards those ideas from the continent of social contracts and so forth. I mean, the whole Declaration of Independence is essentially using those then current theories of social contract to say the king has broken the social contract with us, and therefore we are recognizing that the king no longer rules us, so we are going our own way. And that's really what the Declaration is about. And so what he's doing here is sort of picking that up and running with it in a whole other direction, as we'll see.
Which is itself an incorporation of aspects of a much deeper and longer natural law tradition, going back to the Greeks and Romans, but also through English thinking, especially through thinkers like John Locke.
Hey.
That thinking, that grounding, gave the American Revolution a deep and fundamental mooring. A mooring that, if is lost, turns to more revolutionary ideas, a rejection of truth, a growing sense of relativism, and ultimately a nihilism, that there are no truths worth conserving or living for. The Declaration of Independence, which is, say, the philosophical grounding of the American Revolution, takes an opposite course. It grounds its sense of politics in the laws of nature and nature's God. There are truths that are knowable that can be the guide and the ground for politics. These are self-evident truths. And the first one is that all men are created equal. We're not equal in many aspects, size and shape. We're equal in the fundamentals, in our humanity, which means that none of us have more rights than another. None has a right to rule, and none is condemned to be ruled. This sense of equality at the center of the Declaration of Independence, grounded in nature, not merely the whims of rulers or the whims of Congress or the Supreme Court, is what gives meaning to the
Funny it doesn't mention the presidency or the executive branch.
Nation. Out of that grows our equal fundamental rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which implies that there are other rights, that we aren't just limited to those three rights. It's there, right there, in black and white, or sepia and black. It's not so much that the rights are derived from nature, that every human being is endowed with certain fundamental rights. Among these are the rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that this equality notion doesn't come in as much. I mean, it comes in the Declaration of Independence, but it does wind up getting secured in the Constitution later.
Own lives, we fundamentally have a right to. Our liberty as human beings. The founders preferred the word liberty, which is an old Latin word, as opposed to freedom, a more Germanic word, precisely because it implied that liberty which is inherent to human beings. And we have a right to the pursuit of happiness. They didn't use Locke's formulation of life, liberty, and property, but the broader notion of the pursuit of happiness. It includes property. Property is the flooring, if you will. We have a right to our property. We have a right to acquire property, to buy and sell property. We have a right to add to property through the fruits of our labor. But beyond that, we have a higher and more important right, which is the culmination of our happiness, which is a right to come to know the truth about the most important things, and especially religious truth.
Okay, so this is where I call BS, because my understanding of the period is that, generally speaking, when they talked about the right to property, they tended to mean, usually property and land, and the acquisition of land, because the acquisition of most any other type of property things, especially for the times, weren't worth much, right? There were very few things that one could acquire at the time that would, and I will, there we go, and that would really last that long, if you will. Like, there wasn't anything where, there weren't really antique tables or wardrobes that people would pass on from person to person, unless you had your own castle or hutch or what have you. And so, the Declaration of Independence wasn't just actually written for property owners. Like, this was to try to get the people of America behind this program, because most of the people in the Declaration Hall and Independence Hall were property owners, right? As we'll get to later, the franchise for voting was reserved to property owners. That's what you had to be in order to vote in the first few elections up until, I think, the 1820s. You had to own real property. You had to own land in order to vote. You had to be a white male who owned land. And so this idea that property was a floor and from which to pursue property is hogwash, just flat out hogwash. What people miss about the Declaration of Independence is it is a propaganda piece in some measures, right? It is written not just as a declaration of principles for a new nation. It is that too, but it was also meant to convince the people of the colonies to revolt. It was to join this revolution, which is not at all certain of being successful. It was also meant to convince other countries to support this revolution, France and Holland and all these other countries. It was to set forth the arguments for, as if you ever watched them play 1776, why this illegal treason was in fact a legal one, right? And so it's a document that serves many different purposes. It's not just a declaration of rights. And so, yes, of course they changed it from pursuit of property, in part because in Britain, the ability to obtain property in a country where you were beginning to have a mercantile class, you were beginning to have a middle class, if you will, that could actually obtain property, where, people could get lucky and have a certain amount of industry and actually have a house of their own, beginning in the 1700s and building up, so forth. You didn't really have as much of a chance of that in America. You really wanted to sort of, you wanted to spread it out to as many people as possible. So this notion of, pursuit of happiness being tied to property by necessity, yeah, it's supposed to echo it, absolutely. But it's not as tied as closely as I think he thinks it is.
Hence the grounding of the right to religious liberty, which we will see expressed most famously later in the Constitution itself, in the First Amendment. I might note
First Amendment, not in the Constitution, it's separate.
Here, the great contradiction of slavery. It existed at the time of the founding. Indeed, the draft of the Declaration condemned the slave trade, but great compromises were made with slavery. But most importantly, the seed of its condemnation, the beginnings of the abolitionist movement, actually grow out of the Declaration of Independence and its proclamation that all men are created equal. In addition to the idea of equality and rights,
it creates a tension between two different aspects of American politics. Yes, it declares that all men are created equal, and also crosses out any objection to slavery in it. And it is a tension that doesn't resolve itself for another 100 years.
The other great truth that is self-evident, according to the Declaration, is the question of consent. Legitimate governments must grow out of the consent of the governed. Indeed, if we are equal in fundamentals, we're equally human, we have equal rights, the only way to proceed is through some sense of consent. which in our country is representative forms of government. Lastly, I note that we have a collective right to alter or abolish our government when it does not do its fundamental purpose, which is to secure these rights.
Fair.
And in those cases, we can do something about it if it becomes destructive of those ends. This is oftentimes referred to the right of revolution, but I note that it's immediately moderated and qualified. There has to be a long trail of abuses, and it's not to be done for light and transient reasons. We don't have a right to take the law into our own hands. And if we have a right to abolish government, we also have a duty, an obligation to institute new government. In short,
he's reading way
these
too much
ideas,
into
I
the
would
placement
argue,
of those things in the Declaration, and it's a
that
particular
there
point of
are
view.
truths to be understood in light of the laws of nature and nature's God, and that evident among those truths are that all men are created equal. They equally possess fundamental certain rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The job of government is to secure those rights according to the consent of the governed. Those ideas are the very essence of American conservatism and what we wish to conserve.
And what I think is interesting about this is he's identifying conservatism with these basic rights
by mere majorities,
as if to exclude
they
any
aren't
other political
based on laws. They are grounded in the very nature and essence of things,
as if
which gives
progressivism
conservatism
isn't on this,
a permanent grounding and a fundamental ground for it to proceed. In addition to those more fundamental principles,
that doesn't mean anything.
We would also add a bedrock concept, which is unstated in many ways, but seen throughout everything growing out of the American Revolution and in our Constitution, which is the rule of law. Indeed, the development of the rule of law through history, through British constitutionalism into the American founding, is one of the greatest accomplishments of Western civilization. One need only read history, or perhaps read Shakespeare, to see that throughout much of that history, there wasn't the rule of law. Indeed, the person who had the most power was the one who determined what the law was.
Bear in mind that a lot of Shakespeare is about, especially the tragedies, are about someone breaking some fundamental rule of law and having their ass handed to them. That is literally all of every Shakespearean tragedy.
Through their colonial experience, had learned to rule themselves under British constitutionalism. And through that experience of taxation and increasing despotism, had the experience to continue to rule themselves, and took that as a fundamental element of what their founding was meant to accomplish. They had many experiments to do so. In states, there were numerous failures and great successes. Many states were riven by questions of faction and disagreement. They weren't protecting rights.
Of all the white
the Arts
families,
Federation, passed during the American Revolution, were in many ways a great accomplishment, but also a great failure in what they were unable to do in terms of creating a nation. And all this led to a great constitutional convention in the spring and summer and fall of 1787 that created the American Constitution. That Constitution is a great example, perhaps the greatest example, of constitutionalism in Western civilization. And they created what is today the longest national constitution still in use. It's laid out in
Not
core
longest,
parts,
but oldest.
articles, creating three branches of government: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary.
It's in 5 parts.
Starting with the most democratic to the least.
6.
Beginning with the lawmaking branch. And each 3 of those branches begins with a vesting clause, which is to say the Constitution is one of delegated powers. They're delegated precisely because the Declaration has first established the sovereignty of the people. The people possess rights.
Declaration has nothing to do with the Constitution. They are separate documents. The only branch of the federal government that has delegated powers is the legislative branch. Seriously, look it up. The executive power shall be vested in a president. The judicial power shall be vested in a Supreme Court.
Not the government. Indeed, according to the American understanding of politics, no government, the federal government, state governments, the dog catcher, possess rights at all. They only have certain powers. And those are...
Okay, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of basic constitutional law when it comes to state government. This is where he is completely misconstruing everything that I at least understand about constitutional law when it comes to states. States have what are called general police powers. They have the ability to have unlimited powers that are only limited by their own state constitutions and ultimately by the federal constitutions by virtue of the 14th Amendment. And I'm getting into the weeds here, but bear with me. So, for example, the Obamacare, the Healthcare Act, right, that came down, there was an argument that it couldn't be enforced under the Commerce Clause, right? And there were various arguments for and against that, and ultimately got upheld on a tax act because Congress passed it, and in order to pass something, it has to be upheld under one of Congress's delegated powers under Article 1 of the Constitution. Clear. But it was based on a law passed by the state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts doesn't have to worry about those delegated powers because it has generalized police powers. The federal government, under that case law involving the Healthcare Act, the federal government cannot require you to buy car insurance. The state of California, the state of Tennessee, the state of Texas, they can require you to buy car insurance. They can, because they have general police power. They do not have limited powers the same way the federal government does. This is just flat out wrong, the way he's framing it. Yes, all states have constitutions that do limit their powers in some ways, but that is not what he's really talking about here. He just is flat out wrong.
Out very carefully in our American constitutional system. Enumerated, especially in the first article concerning the legislature, and then less so, but significantly, concerning the executive and judiciary. The Constitution also includes a Bill of Rights, which importantly, especially in the First and Second Amendments, protect our most fundamental freedoms.
Not included in the Constitution. Added afterwards. Bill of Rights includes 10 amendments. The first two are not the most important ones. I mean, they're important.
Our religious liberty, the right to speech, free speech and free press.
Yeah.
Rights to assembly and petition, the first. And the second, the right.
He skips over establishment. Congress shall not make a law establishing religion. They always skip that part because it's not good for them. Because it means you cannot you're not really supposed to favor one religion over another, or any religion.
Bear arms. Those were understood to be fundamental rights necessary to protect in Republican government.
But not established.
Today, we often see the Bill of Rights as the Constitution. That's especially how the Supreme Court often looks at it. But it's important to understand that they were amendments, additions to the body of the Constitution itself. The result of all this is a decentralized structure of a strong and energetic but limited federal government, a government that allows for a decentralization of power into the states and to local government, and because of local government, self-government. This system of governing, of limited powers at the top, of more powers at the state level, and as many powers as possible actually not controlled by politics, but allowed to be governed by self-governing individuals is what creates the essence of American democracy.
So that, I mean, there's an argument to be made that that was the initial outline of government when the Constitution was made. The idea was that the federal government would be, I mean, to be fair, that was really the push and pull of a lot of the compromises that were made when the Constitution was written. This is the whole argument between Hamilton and Jefferson, between the Federalist and Anti-Federalist parties over the first 10, 20 years of the government up until, the Jacksonian debates later on. And, it's that idea of, is each state a nation? And therefore, is each state, are we just a collection of nations? Are we essentially a European Union, if you will, 200 years early, or are we United States of America? Are we singular? Are we plural? And that was the debate. Like, there is no singular answer to this. Like, this is something we can debate to this day. The argument, prior to, I would say, the 1980s, was that the Civil War resolved that question. The 14th Amendment gets passed, and the answer is finished. The federal trumps the state. And then over the last 25 years, partially because of the Federalist Society and a lot of other movements, there's been pushback on that, especially with training videos like this, which purport to say, well, it's all about power going down as far as possible. There are legitimate arguments to be had, frankly, on both sides of this. Like, I'm not saying necessarily that they're 100% wrong. I disagree with them, but I see the arguments at least. That there's a discussion to be had. Does the federal government derive power from the states, which then derive power from the people, or does the federal government derive power from the people independent of the states? There's a whole political theory discussion to be had there that, of course, he's ignoring.
Institutions of civil society, churches, schoolrooms, families, those are the most important political institutions in our system.
Churches first.
Those are the ones that play the most important role in shaping
City
our
Hall,
characters,
by the way.
Shaping ourselves to be good, self-governing citizens. The Constitution, the federal Constitution and the state constitutions, create a framework by which we can govern ourselves. They are meant to secure the rights of the Declaration of Independence. They are meant to uphold the powers defined in their documents.
Again, they have their own definitions of individual rights and powers, right? They are themselves independent of the Declaration of Independence. Again, the Declaration of Independence is simply meant to acknowledge the breach between the United States and the British Crown. It has nothing ultimately to do with identifying the rights we have as people, because again, it's among those rights. There are many rights here.
Especially those that are delegated to the federal Constitution and limited at the federal level. And they are meant to provide liberty for ourselves and our posterity. This conception of government, these principles, was the American consensus, despite a history of great disagreements.
And it wasn't.
And indeed, the one exception proves the rule. And that was when we had a fundamental disagreement over a fundamental question: slavery and the Civil War. John C. Calhoun famously said,
I will be fair to him, he at least recognizes that the cause of the Civil War was slavery.
Slavery was a positive good. Chief Justice Taney said that slaves were property and that they had no rights that we were bound to respect. And even Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, said that this should be solved through the questions of popular sovereignty. Anything as long as the majority consented. It was Abraham Lincoln who objected to all of these arguments and instead recalled the nation to its founding principles, recalled it to its Constitution, but a Constitution which was understood in light of the principles of the Declaration. These ideas came to be challenged, and our system changed in many fundamental ways after the Civil War, especially the beginnings of the 20th century. When a movement, a growing movement,
Love how he skips over the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which are truly what ended slavery. It wasn't just Lincoln saying, waving his hands and saying Declaration of Independence rules, and slaveries were free.
ideas, especially coming from Germany and France and educational systems in Europe,
Oh, yes.
led to what is called progressivism.
Oh,
The
evil
progressives
progressivism.
had certain anti-foundational principles at heart. They did not believe there were any truths or first principles, and grounded their system on a sense of relativism. They
Still
also believed
wrong.
that there were no principles that withstood the test.
As far as I know, none of these are true about progressive ideals as I understand them. As I understand them, progressive ideals tend to revolve around, not being bound by original principles, trying to bring more people into the system, et cetera, et cetera.
Time. They were merely ideas that were historically bound and grounded. They believed that all things would progress and evolve. That led them to a new theory of unlimited government. Indeed, they wanted to change the limited constitutional system that defined our republic to one of a growing, evolving, and living constitution. The key operational part that they designed was what they called administration, what we today refer to as administrative government. Government would be mostly conducted by experts and bureaucrats who were not within the Congress or the executive, at least in terms of being subject to the consent of the governed. They were independent of politics, separated, such that they...
How dare we want an environmental scientist looking at water and figuring out if it's safe to drink or not? How dare we?
conduct government outside of consent. That was also based on a new theory of rights. The job of government was still to secure those rights, but those rights were no longer those consistent with and defined by our nature as much as created by government, especially by courts.
Citation needed.
Based on the demands of groups, claims. What the progressives wanted was to establish a freedom from nature, a liberation from human nature, such that it becomes the autonomous pursuit of self-realization. And so the job of government is to secure that liberation of what the human wills. An objection to the progressive movement, actually, is the origins of what we today call conservatism. But here I would actually associate the actual beginnings of...
One thing I want to back up here on this is that I forget if he gets into this a little bit later, but a lot of this administrative state began in the wake of World War II and the Depression, in part because it became very clear that the old style government was not catching up to how fast commerce was advancing between 1901 and 2000, right? If you look at how America was constituted in 1901 and then look how it was constituted in 2001, that is a vastly different universe than it was between 1801 and 1901, right? Still different, but logarithmically different. And the government had to be keeping up to reflect that. And to say that the administrative state was not, ruling without, was ruling without the consent of the governed, misses the fact that Congress and the executive branch to varying degrees, and the judicial branch for that matter, all had the ability to have input into that system and had the ability to police them in different ways. And in many cases, Congress just abdicated the responsibility, Democrats and Republicans. And that if many times over, Congress has had the ability and often did just overrule things that the administrators did. Issue new regulations, issue laws that overturn regulations. Judges would say, no, administrators, you've done this incorrectly, right? So again, a bit of hogwash here. Also this sense of, being against nature. That argument only works if you accept the original premise that the Declaration of Independence somehow carries through to the Constitution, which is not at all clear.
Conservatism with a rejection of progressivism. And I do so to remind us of the debate here in the American context of these two great alternatives. In particular, in the election of 1912, both Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt.
Woodrow Wilson is absolutely terrible for a lot of different reasons, so I'm kind of with him on that. But and to say Taft is a conservative, they were all, like as he's about to say, they were all progressives.
We're pursuing and arguing for progressive ideas. And then later we associate this argument with Calvin Coolidge, for instance, began to see that this was a threat to our Constitution and behind the Constitution to the groundings.
And also, what Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were arguing in favor of, and Taft to that matter, in their terms of progressivism, was vastly different to the progressivism that he's railing against before this. That wasn't about, culture wars or whatever else he's shouting at the clouds about. That was about breaking trusts. That was about trying to, make sure wealth was shared. That was about allowing unions to exist in the first place and not have union workers be killed by Pinkertons, right? That was about regulating working conditions and regulating food that we eat. That was the original progressive movement here. That's what he's now railing against, is safe foods. He's railing against safe working conditions, the 40-hour work week, stopping children from working, stopping, people from being forced to work 80 hours and, being put into debt because in order to work for a factory, you had to actually work in their factory town. In order to work in the factory town, you had to actually rent from their apartments, and you had to go into debt to do that because if you didn't have money to begin with, because you were unemployed, you had to take a loan from the factory, which meant that you were continually in debt because then you had to take a loan out to get the food. And so you're starting out with debt, which means you have to keep working for them to pay them off at the beginning. And, all these things that progressive ideals in the early part of the 20th century, that's essentially what he's railing against when it comes to, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and that early progressive movement. That's what he's conflating different types of progressivism here. And that's what he's up against. Apparently he wants to end the 40-hour work week. He wants to end overtime. He wants to end food safety.
Field groundings in the Declaration of Independence. That pushback, that beginning of conservatism, we see then argued in, especially in the judicial context, where it first became evident. We see it in the pushback against the New Deal that ultimately culminated in Barry Goldwater's campaign, or in the arguments against the Great Society, which led to the great efforts of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. So how then do we proceed? How do we learn from the principles of the American founding going forward in a world of disagreement, in a world of particular circumstances?
And again, he's conflating this idea of, I guess, what you might call moral relativism in the scope of progressivism, being unhinged from basic American values, with economic progressivism as a mode of, worker safety and progressive taxation, right? And they're two completely different things, right? I mean, a lot of, frankly, populists in Europe, for example, are actually socially conservative at the same time that they are in some ways socialist, right? They are providing welfare for workers. They are providing, Pinochet is the perfect example of this, or Perón in Argentina. Are both examples of that, where they are actually like very socially conservative, but also very economically liberal, because they are, very much, although, giving kickbacks to the people that they like, they're also providing money to workers, and they're, giving, all these protections to workers. And so this idea that these are linked inexorably is a shell game, right? The culture wars have nothing to do, at the end of the day, I mean, they do in some ways, but whether or not we have safe food and water has nothing to do with a culture war about, trans people's rights and so forth. I mean, they're both important, incredibly important, but lumping them all together just obfuscates everything.
This is informed by those ideas. And here I actually want to reintroduce an idea that itself is built upon an older and more classical understanding of politics. A world of politics, what I would suggest the founders had at least one foot in. That is to introduce the cardinal virtue of prudence. It's in the Declaration of Independence. If you look at that famous second paragraph, the first part of the paragraph introduces all those abstract ideas. All men are created equal. These are self-evident truths. Government secure those rights based on consent. But that's one sentence. And the very next sentence begins, prudence will dictate. That is to say, prudence is this operational virtue, this moral virtue, this central virtue of the statesman, which translates abstract truths, fundamentals, and how do we apply them in particular circumstances?
Slow down.
And that is also an essential quality of conservatism. Taking a principle, a thing that does not change, that's abstract, that's true, that's a universal, and applying it in particular circumstances, such that it has an actual reality, also a truth, in that time. Conservatism should not be approached as itself a set of doctrinal ideas that never change. Our policy disagreements are just that, things that change depending on the circumstances. We must be consistent and strong and clear on the principles of the matter, but we must be adaptive and innovative and flexible in practice. And that is itself an essence, an essential quality of conservatism. That allows us to have great agreement in principle, and to allow that agreement in principle to then give us the ability to deliberate and build consensus on the particulars. So what we need in the end is a rediscovery of conservatism, a reborn conservatism, a conservatism that is grounded in the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Those truths, those self-evident truths according to the laws of nature and nature's God, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, of legitimacy of government coming from the consent of the governed. A conservatism that understands man's self-interest but also sees his capacity for virtue. A conservatism of the Constitution limits government, but it sees that government performs its job effectively and energetically. It refines popular opinion through representation. And it uses the structures of government, the separation of powers, the checks and balances, to keep government limited and secure rights, all through an extended nation of states and a decentralization of power to magnify and strengthen self-government. That understanding of the grounding of conservatism creates a natural fusion. It reminds economic conservatives of a fuller understanding of the human person and prevents the development of that sense of autonomous individualism that we associate so much with modern liberalism.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, how dare we want autonomism?
It reminds traditional conservatives of the rational ground, the moral principles of their ideas that are needed to distinguish between good traditions and bad traditions, without which tradition merely wanders and follows history and its trends. And it gives national security conservatives or national interest conservatives or national conservatives, it gives them the substance they lack by tying nationalism to a particular nation.
I love, by the way, the lecturing and hectoring of other types of conservatives here, and how dare you, and linking national conservatism to a particular nation.
To our nation, to this nation, so conceived and so dedicated. America's principles were the key to Frank Meyer's original fusionism in the 1960s, which tied together traditionalist and libertarians.
I don't have time to get into that.
Those principles were also the key to Ronald Reagan's conservatism in the 1980s. Those times have passed, but the principles have not. The truths of our founding are today increasingly under attack. They have been for some time in our universities, but are increasingly also under attack in our K-12 educational system, especially bad history ideas being introduced into those schools.
Bad history.
To see our country as systemically racist. It has its flaws, for sure, but it completely misses how its beginnings and aspirations corrected those flaws. And
yes, our country does have flaws, and critical race theory is a subject that is taught at college level and graduate school level. And recognizing that slavery was mentioned in the Declaration of Independence and a compromise in both the Declaration and the Constitution was in the forefront of a lot of the discussions that went on in the government and politics throughout the first 150 years of our government, that when he talks about how, consent of the governed, right? The consent of the governed is endemic to the national experience. Folks, he's full of it, right? Who were the governed? Everyone in the country as the country expanded across the continent. Well, that's great, but you know who couldn't consent? Women until 1920. Black people until 1868, and then they really weren't even many places allowed to really vote until the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. People without property couldn't vote until 1820. So in a lot of these cases, and a lot of these sort of beautiful words that were written by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and when the Constitution was drafted, the governed couldn't vote on it. The governed couldn't consent to these grand, beautiful, conservative ideals. They couldn't. They weren't allowed to. And then as time went on and more of these people were allowed finally to actually participate and actually try to say, hey, let's get this government working for us as well, these people try to take more and more of it away from those people who weren't white men or white people. Bastards.
To our great government and great country today. Those ideas are also under attack in our politics itself, especially because of the vast expansion of the modern state, of administrative bureaucracy, which is becoming increasingly ideological in its regulatory actions. And we see this attack throughout our culture and society in various ways all around us. But I just want to remind us that our objective here, our common objective, is to save our country. Its underlying principles and way of life. The idea of equal rights for all, special privileges for none, under the laws of nature and nature's...
Yes, by all means, let's give equal rights for all, special privileges for none. Definitely no tax cuts for anyone. And, veterans shouldn't have any extra things at all. Certainly no In fact, you know what? You know what I should think? I think we should get rid of the tax breaks for, let's say, churches. That sounds good to me. Under laws of nature and nature's God. Again, a god of nature. I mean, Freya's a god of nature, right?
The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
I'm going to
Of
be petty again.
recognition.
Back up just a second here. I'm going to be petty. Ready? Ready for me to be petty? Ready for me to be petty? Here we go.
Nature and nature's God. The right to life,
Whoops. Okay, so if you want to be consistent, guys, if you want to be consistent when you're doing these things, all right? Equal rights for all, second line, small s, right? Under laws of nature and nature's God, small a, the right to life, liberty, and... Okay, the pursuit of happiness, capital T. Should be small t there, folks. Should be a small t. That's what $70 million gets you. Hey, maybe if you're going to fight for conservatism, you should probably know the rules of English.
in the pursuit of happiness. Of a recognition of our rights to property. And to the
I
fruits
don't
of
know
our
why property is capitalized. Would love to know that. Didn't realize property was so important, or that we were speaking German. Also, not sure why there's a right to property. It's not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, or, for that matter, in the Constitution. There's a right to contract.
But also to our more fundamental right of religious liberty.
But not a right to be free from the establishment of religion.
That government, legitimate government, must be based on the consent of the governed. That all
of white people.
Government stems from the rule of law, and that our government is one of delegated powers of limited constitutional government.
At the federal level.
All of which is designed to preserve and protect
white people.
Not only the rights which we are endowed, but our ability to be self-governing and to rule ourselves. These principles, these ideas are actually the source of our recovery of conservatism, as well as the recovery of our country itself. It's a true understanding of the nature of man, the nature of politics, and a true understanding of justice. And that makes our country worth saving, worth recovering, worth conserving.
Aww.
Thank you.
I feel so inspired, don't you? So that is the whole thing, 30 minutes long. I've been talking for a lot longer than that. Thank you for joining me on this. Please like and subscribe. Share it with people if you'd like to. And we'll be doing a few more of these probably next week. And as always, keep calm, keep fighting, and keep left.